Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anurekha Chariwag, Assistant Professor, Department of Sociology, Savitribai Phule, Pune University. Today we are going to discuss the module Modernization of Indian Tradition. This module has been written by Vidya-mitra, Research Scholar, Department of Sociology, Savitribai Phule, Pune University. In this module we are going to discuss about the definitions of modernization, especially locating it within the modernization theory. We will also discuss the history of modernization in India, especially the whole notions of Sanskritization and Westernization. We will also discuss the little and great traditions and also understand the process of urbanization, industrialization and its relationship to the processes of modernization. And at the end, we will understand it through the critiques of the modernization theory. This module attempts to bring out the ways in which scholars have looked at the processes of modernization and its influence on the so-called traditions in the Indian society. It focuses on the key arguments related to modernization theory, traces the history of modernization as a process, and looks at different arguments put forth by scholars like Redfield, Srinivas and others. The module also tries to understand the different changes that took place in the social structures in India both at the micro and at the macro level. The module then focuses on urbanization, industrialization, advanced communication, challenges in the educational sector, and so on as a result of modernization. The module also traces the linkages of the national spirit with modernization and finally ends with a critique of the modernization theory. What is modernization? The term modernization generally refers to the process of transition from a traditional agrarian society to the kind of modern society that is based on trade and industry. Thus, it should be thought of as a continuous dynamic process rather than a single state. However, as a singular concept, it is difficult to precisely define modernization. According to Horowitz, every attempt to define modernization in terms of an operational set of variables results in a new set of ideas which have relatively little to do with the original concept. However, some of the important features that modernization comprises can be viewed as the psychological, the normative, the structural and the technological, argues Singh. The psychological conceptualization of modernization view individuals in the modernization process as being oriented towards mobility and innovation. According to the normative conceptualization, norms and values prevail over the individual psyche, thereby linking modernization to the existing cultural traditions of the West. The structural conceptualization revolves around external structures such as bureaucracy, democracy, economy and so on. According to theorists such as Parson, modern society is defined by these features. Lastly, the technological conceptualization views this process purely in terms of material progress and advanced infrastructure. Finally, what is the relationship between modernity and tradition? The most common approach is to view modernity and tradition as two antithetical elements. Society, social institutions and actors in them are either traditional or modern, and modernization is viewed as an inevitable process of social change from tradition to modernity. But is it really as simplistic as that? Did the advent of modernization radically alter the traditional social structure of India and make it completely modern, or do both tradition and modernity coexist in India? The following account will attempt to look at this relationship more closely. Modernization theory. Modernization theory is an umbrella term used for a range of perspectives that sought to explain the processes of social change in the Third World during the 50s and the 60s. Although the early classical theorists such as Comte, Weber, Marx and Durkheim were interested in the modernization of the West, the present modernization theory is primarily concerned with the modernization of developing non-modern nation, argues Deshpande. After the Second World War, which has hastened the process of decolonization, there were many newly formed nation states whose main agenda was the modernization of their society. They aimed to achieve material progress through the principles of science and rationality. This was occurring at the peak of the Cold War, when the United States spent a lot of resources on initiating modernization studies in these newly developing nations. Daniel Lerner carried out one of the most famous of early modernization studies in his book called The Passing of Traditional Society, published in 1958. Lerner examined the modernization process in Middle Eastern countries. He carried out a sample survey in the underdeveloped countries and observed village society. He concluded that modernization is a global process. According to him, traditional society is disappearing and urbanization is on the increase. He gave particular importance to the role of mass media, which he believed to be associated with other features of development such as urbanization and education. For Lerner, modernity is not possible through the changes in institutions institutions but also in individuals. He identified three types of people in the newly independent societies of the third world: traditional, transitional, and modern. According to him, modern individuals were happier, better informed, and relatively young. People in the transitional stage were found in societies that were caught between tradition and modernity and tended to be more prone to extremisms due to their unstable social situation. Another important theory that sought to explain modernization and development was given by Walt Whitman and Rostow, who suggested that all societies can be placed in one of the 5 categories or stages of economic growth. The first stage is characterized by traditional society, wherein the majority of the people are engaged in subsistence agriculture and more investments are channeled in services or activities such as military and religion. In this stage, people have no access to science and technology. The second stage, identified by Rostow, is called precondition for the takeoff, where the economy undergoes a transition for building up of conditions for growth on takeoff. New ideas which support economic progress arise along with education, business, better transportation and communication. However, in spite of the development of some types of modern manufacturing, traditional social structures and production techniques continue to coexist, forming a kind of dual society. The third stage is called the takeoff stage of economic growth. It is characterized by active economic growth due to economic, political, and technological changes. There is a rapid increase in investments, industries, business, enterprises, and commercialization of agriculture. There is an overall increase in productivity in this stage. The fourth stage is called the drive to maturity, where the main focus is on the extension of modern technology over other sectors of the economy, especially heavy industry. In this stage, between 10 to 20% of the national income is invested. Production now is more a matter of choice and luxury than necessity. The final stage is called the age of high consumption, in which the leading actors in the society shift towards producing durable consumer goods and services. By this point, almost all basic needs are satisfied and there is a focus on welfare-oriented activities and issues of equality and security. History of modernization in India. Modernization can be glimpsed through both structural transformation of Indian society and cultural changes. It is safe to say that the process began as a result of colonization when there was a direct encounter of the India's traditional society with the modernizing West. Traditionally, the social structure in India was based on caste system, which was a closed hierarchical system based on notions of purity and pollution. Colonizers introduced the earliest instruments of modernization such as Western education, bureaucracy, system of civil rights, and a modern superstructure of state and economy, among others, argues Singh. Exposure to these change agents led to the creation of a new political culture and sense of nationalism. The combination of increased technology and Western education together created a change in the traditional structure. It resulted in the formulation of a middle class which was largely absent previously. However, this new class did not completely break away from the traditional social structure because most of the people who comprised of it belonged to the upper caste, and thus there remained a class-caste congruency. In the post-independence period, modernization process followed the same pattern set during the colonial era. Since many of the leaders in the national movement had been educated in the West, there was a recognition of the benefits that modernization had brought to the West, and therefore the need to bring it to the Indian nation to become a stronger and more progressive nation. They realized early on that this meant a radical reorganization of Indian society along with the elimination of many of its cultural evils. As a result, the zamindari system, princely estates, and several other systems were made illegal, Singh argues. The main aim of the modernization project in India was to make India an economically developed and socially just and egalitarian republic through advancements in modern education, science, and technology. While the colonial experience made the Indian leadership conscious of the need to attain a more progressive society through the advent of modernization, it also made them conscious of the Indian identity, its tradition and culture, which they acclaimed to be of continuing significance. Sanskritization and Westernization. One of the earlier approaches to social change in India was the concept of Sanskritization, which was first used by M. N. Srinivas to explain the process of social mobility within the traditional social structure of India. Srinivas describes Sanskritization as a process where individuals from lower caste develop certain customs and rituals of their upper caste while simultaneously giving up some of their own in order to elevate their position in caste hierarchy. For example, they adopted many upper caste ways of dressing, rules of commensality, and many rites and rituals. At the same time, they gave up eating meat, consuming alcohol, and many of their own rituals such as animal sacrifice, which were looked down upon by upper caste, particularly the Brahmin caste. By doing so, they intended to gain some upward mobility over a generation or two. Singh argues westernization, on the other hand, is described by Srinivas as the changes brought about in the Indian society as a result of colonization at various levels, including technology, ideology and values. According to him, the colonial era brought with it the values of rationalism and humanitarianism, which were concretized through the new educational, technological and scientific institutions established by the British rulers. Although westernization was largely ushered in by the upper caste, it had an impact on all castes, thereby bringing about radical changes in the Indian social structure, argues Deshpande. Little and great traditions. The concept of little and great traditions was given by anthropologist Robert Redfield and was used by Singer and Marriott to analyze the processes of social change in India. The main ideas used in this approach to study social change are civilization and social organization of tradition, which comprises of both cultural and social structures. This approach takes an evolutionary approach that the structure of tradition grows in two stages. The first stage is orthogenetic or indigenous evolution, in other words, evolution through internal elements. The second stage is through heterogenetic evolution, that is through encounters with external cultures and civilizations. According to this approach, any civilization consists of two kinds of traditions and the constant interactions between the two. Great tradition is related to the literate social elite, the minority who are capable of understanding, analyzing and interpreting social reality. Little traditions, on the other hand, is associated with the so-called illiterate, rural peasants and common folk of the civilization. Great traditions comprise of a body of collective heritage and knowledge, while little traditions consist of localized indigenous heritage and knowledge. The two traditions are not independent of each other, rather they influence and affect each other. The concepts of universalization and parochialization are related to this. Universalization refers to the processes through which little traditions become great traditions, and parochialization refers to the downward spread of knowledge from great traditions to little traditions, where universalized ideas trickle down and influence local level practices. Structural changes in India. Singh argues that the process of modernization has led to certain changes in the already present structures of a society at both the micro and the macro level. These transformation has led to a reorganization of a whole fabric of social relationship and also leads to the growth and institutionalization of new roles and group structures. An example of this structural differentiation can be a shift from the joint to the nuclear families in India. The earlier joint families performed the role of procreation and rearing of new members for a given society, along with performing various roles in their other spheres like education, leisure, occupation. On the contrary, nuclear families in industrial societies, which are differentiated from earlier joint or extended families, perform the more specialized role. The functioning of modernization at the macro and the micro levels of society is explained henceforth. Changes in the macro level. Modernization led to structural changes in social, economic, political as well as cultural spheres of society. The colonial rule in India contributed to the establishment and growth of modern bureaucratic structure following a basic rational framework to employ civil servants into different ranks. However, during the initial stage of the British rule, there seemed to be a blur between clerical posts requiring greater responsibility in terms of the pay the post holders used to get. However, by the end of 18th century, greater level of professionalism tended to grow in civil service sector. Appointments began to take place on the basis of merit rather than on the basis of patronage as practiced during earlier times. There also happened a slow Indianization of bureaucracy as greater numbers of Indian elites proliferated into the administrative sector. In the post-independence period, however, the social background of the new recruits in the bureaucracy had changed. Earlier, the recruited ones were mostly from higher income elite families. But since independence, the class and caste composition has become a little more heterogeneous. Thus, studies have shown that recruits from lower class or caste positions are still few in numbers. Nevertheless, since independence, there occurred a transfer of power from the hands of English-educated upper-class elite bureaucrats to regional populistic type of political elite, from middle and lower classes and caste hailing from rural areas. These newer types of political elites tended to represent indigenous cultures and often lack university education, which most of the bureaucratic elites have. Consolidation of British rule in India has also led to the formation of a new business elite who were exposed to the technological and scientific advancements, as well as the surge of economic growth happening in Britain due to the Industrial Revolution. Though India in the past had flourishing trade linkages with countries of Africa, Middle East, Eastern Asian countries like Malaya and Indonesia, growing contact with the colonizers in fact led to a historic shift from past traditions to a newer kind of capitalist economic growth. Post-1900s, Indian industrial elites started catching up with the British. These business elites, who came mostly from mercantile caste, played an important role in modernization process, and they also became active in the national movement. Thus, their rise did not lead to a radical rupture in the Indian traditional economic scenario. Rather, these business elites seemed to blend the constituents of modernity and tradition. However, gradually they started resembling the Western industrial elite and now have major command over the ongoing Indian political situation and exercise control over pressure groups. With industrialization, there emerged new factories which pulled labor force from rural areas to the cities, which gave rise to the new industrial working class. On one hand, this led to a gradual wearing away of traditional ties, while on the other, this forged newer patterns of social relationships. For example, trade unions, which have organizational linkages with each other on a national level, played a major integrative role among workers. Modernization also established a democratic populist political structure after independence. One can see growing participation of the masses by means of caste associations, tribal groups, ethnic communities in the democratic political scenario. There are different pressure groups competing with each other to gain access to power positions. Briefly, the political trends in India since independence have largely been a series of reconciliations with demands articulated by regional interest groups, argues Singh. Thus, on one hand, one can see modernist ideas being reflected in terms of practicing of ideals like democracy, secularism by the state. At the same time, this political modernization also has led to the growing consolidation of traditional institutions like caste, associations, ethnic communities in terms of articulating their demands. Changes in the micro level. Right from the early years of sociology, the family and community have been the central areas of analysis within the discipline. The family is a primary unit around which society is structured, and within the Indian society, the importance of family cannot be overemphasized. Just as other structures have undergone change, so too has the family in the face of modernizing elements. In the traditional society, the family carried out economic, religious, educational, and protective functions. In the modern society, Hutter argues, its importance seems to have been waning as most of these functions have been taken over as a result of increased involvement of government, economic enterprise, and education. In India, as in many other parts of the world, one of the most visible changes in the family structure brought about by modernization is a shift from joint or extended families to smaller nuclear families. Traditional agrarian society, argues Singh, across the globe were generally characterized by extended families. These families, more often than not, were patriarchal and patriarchal, as a result of which female members of the family had a subordinate position within the family hierarchy. Further, the head of the family tended to be the eldest male, who was also the decision maker. Marriage in such families was considered to be a matter of family concern rather than personal relationship. Singh argues notions of individualism and personal freedom were not present in such societies, as collective interests were given more importance than individual interest. Knowledge was passed on from one generation to another orally, due to which age was an important factor in deciding social status. The political, economic, and social changes brought on by modernization inevitably led to a change in this traditional family structure. Industrialization and urbanization forced the former peasant folk to leave their traditional homes and enter the cities, resulting in the breakdown of the extended family and the formation of the conjugal nuclear family. Kinship ties became weaker within this form of family, and there was an increased sense of personal freedom. One of the most significant changes brought along with this is the role of women in the families. In the traditional extended family setup, women almost had no autonomy. Younger women were controlled by older women and men of the household. Women's roles were limited to household labor and caretaking. With the advent of modernization, traditional roles for women, especially with regard to paid labor, were slowly changing, as one can see women increasingly joining the workforce. Indian village is further a central category in the popular imagining of India by Western rulers and the native middle class alike. In fact, it is often considered a microcosm reflecting the macrocosm of Indian nation. One of the salient features of village in the Indian imagination is the village identity, the strong sense of cohesion and solidarity among members. The traditional power balance, argues Singh, always lay within the upper caste landholding groups. However, since independence due to state's modernization project, the village began to go through a variety of changes, especially with respect to economic institutions. One of the biggest factors of social change in the village has been land reform. Land reforms, which included abolition of land, inclusion of land ceilings, and abolition of intermediaries, has changed the economic fabric of the village. Although these reforms did not drastically change the traditional social structure, since the ownership of land still largely remained with traditional elites, there was a marked change in power relations. Singh argues, while political power was previously closely tied to ownership of land, the new democratic and legal rights of previously downtrodden groups enabled them to move up the political hierarchy. Urbanization, industrialization, and modernization. Modernization is often linked with urbanization and industrialization. Various works in sociology construct binaries such as rural-urban, mechanical-organic solidarity, which not simply assumes a kind of transition from society from one phase to another, but also the development of newer forms of moral as well as cultural patterns. In the case of each binary, the former part is associated with tradition and the later with modernization. Modernization in India thus should be understood within the light of historical factors. The very construction of cities according to caste-based hierarchies and thereby determining which site should be allotted to which family was a traditional form of urbanization in pre-colonized India. In this scheme, the king or the priest were allotted the most favorable locality, while the untouchables were restricted to the city's periphery, far off from the upper caste. Therefore, in pre-industrial era, it is hardly possible to equate modernization with urbanization. However, when those hierarchical forms of urbanization did start breaking down, the question which arose was, did industrialization actually contribute to the modernization of urbanization? Studies shows that there is no stark tradition modernity dichotomy or rural-urban binary existing in Indian cities. According to Singh, there is a persistence of the traditional patterns in the cities. On one hand, urbanization in India has a modernizing effect on the cultures in India. At the same time, it is also inclined towards reinforcing the traditions. A majority of the population has migrated to cities in India since independence. Now, according to Singh, the rate of urbanization is slow. The rate of cultural modernization has not been reduced themselves. Urbanization has resulted in increased number of heavy industries, increased capital investment, raising significance of mass media, though the rate of industrial growth has been less in post-independent India. This is why the relation between urbanization and industrialization has to be carefully scrutinized in the context of modernization. Singh argues if the term urbanization is used to denote the loss of traditional socio-economic and cultural structures, then industrialization does not always contribute to urbanization in India. Colonized India started expanding with greater heterogeneity of ethnicities and the blurring of boundaries of caste-based neighborhoods of the earlier times. With modern means of transportation, monetary transactions, banking, medicine, political culture, etc., the foundation of cultural modernization was established. Communication and cultural modernization. According to Yogendra Singh, Western contact had also enhanced the medium of communication throughout India, by means of which greater levels of cultural diffusion and modernization started taking place. Introduction of the printing press, telegraph, postal service, railways by the British enhanced the whole transport and communication system, which ultimately increased the pace of modernization in India. Circulation of newspapers and periodicals in both regional languages as well as English can be observed from different reports during the British rule in India. Growth in postal service system, expansion of roadways, railways, waterways and airways led to improved contact between regions. This also challenged the foundation of the hierarchy of caste based on purity pollution norm, since people belonging to different castes had to travel by the same train or bus. However, technological development did not simply bring about modernizing impacts in the Indian scenario, but also in some cases aided in reinforcing tradition. For example, better transportation or growing postal services did not simply lead to increased communication among people belonging to different regions, but Singh argues also aided mobilization of caste associations or activities of other traditional groups. Thus, a newer kind of consciousness started building up among individuals as they tried to identify themselves with these traditional institutions. Thus, in the Indian context, modernization came with a baggage of reiterating traditions. Nationalism and modernization. Nationalism is an awareness of a single nationhood and associated with consciousness of a certain political identity. The sociological manifestation of such consciousness would be the idea of a nation state. In the context of the British rule in India, the modernizing impact it carried with it, the political aspect of nationalism is crucial to analyze. Nationalism in this light was considered to be essential for any political organization to thrive for the development of consciousness and the process of bringing about change. Nationalism defined, inspired and justified the means and ends of social change while maintaining cohesiveness among people on the national level. It also aided rapid political mobilization of the masses. The Indian National Congress was primarily leading the nationalist movement, and from its inception it took a secular stand. Led by Nehru, it advocated the idea of India as a secular democratic nation. Nationalism in India resulted from various economic transformations as well as the rise of the middle class. However, one of the major grounds on which it was based was to resist colonial rule in the native land. In the process, the nationalist forces identified the need to revive indigenous cultures rooted in traditions. But these indigenous cultures were essentially Hindu cultures, which created increasing communal tensions between Hindu nationalists and Muslims and ultimately resulted in the partition. The partition had somewhat reversed the process of modernization due to communal tensions and polarization between the two communities, argues Mehta. Modernization in education. In pre-independent India, modernization occurred in the realms of education. Rather, one can argue that West influence education became a key harbinger of modernization. Before the British rule, only the upper caste, especially the twice born, were supposed to be the receivers of education. The subject matter of education was limited to being esoteric and metaphysical. Thus, the education system was hierarchical, closed, and based on the ascription of caste status. During the colonial rule, the content of education was radically changed by the then British rulers. English as a language was introduced through Maculate's minutes to create an educated English-speaking class of people so that official work could be assigned to the native population. However, with modern Western education came a more liberal and scientific worldview. Ideas of equality, liberty, humanism were introduced. A broad structure of education was set up which could roughly be divided into three major sections: primary and vernacular language with the exception of missionary schools, education in secondary schools, and finally college and university level education. Singh argues, however, access to this kind of education, especially higher education, was restricted to only handful few. Thus, modernization through college education never happened as a mass scale. However, education still had one of the major carriers of modernization in India, which led to the enlightenment process and growth of Indian intelligentsia, who not only led the movement for independence but at the same time fought for socio-cultural reformations. Traditionally, women were denied the right to education except those hailing from a privileged background. However, during the end of 19th century, with the drive towards reformation and modernization, the issue of women's education came to the fore. The debate regarding men and women's differing curriculum should be scrutinized first. Initially, curricula for women centered only on training them according to the supposed traditional domestic role, since women were never expected to work outside home. This view on women education was shared both by liberals and social reformers. However, there were differing views also. For example, men argued that the key purpose of education is to encourage critical thoughts, but in most cases, women's education became a matter of concern only for bringing about reforms in the existing structure, not radically changing the structure itself. Jannana argues there happened a differential spread of education among women because of various practices like parda, early marriage of girls, and so on in different parts of India. However, separate school for girls came up, women teachers were appointed, and thereby more and more girls came under light of education. The role of Christian missionaries and social reformers was also crucial in this regard. The social reform and women's education became two intertwining agendas of the reformers in the colonial period. Critiques of modernization theory. Some of the important critiques of the modernization are, first of all, the whole notion of modernization itself promotes a dichotomy between modern and traditional. This implies the process of social change that was happening in the Western countries, while the latter indicates social situation in the third world. Modernization, therefore, is assumed to be a transition from a latter stage to the former under the influence of the West. Thus, modernization theorists ignore the fact that third world countries could not or still are in difficulty to modernize themselves as per the standards of the West because of long years of exploitation since the era of colonization. The gap between the poor and the rich countries is ever increasing, which restricts modernization in the decolonized nations. Since the conceptualization itself is a import from the West, the colonial rulers themselves had decided the yardstick of modernization. Indian social scientists have also succumbed to the West imposed hegemonic ideas and misconceptions about third world reality. As Kamath argues, this is clearly an instance of present day cultural imperialism, and Western Indologists tended to prove that Indians and people of other colonized countries were inferior and somewhat at a lower stage of growth as compared to the West. Thus, from its inception, modernization theory has faced severe criticism because of its simplistic arguments, lack of historicity, criticality, and ideological bias. Even recent approaches to modernization can be considered weak because it has done to a certain extent shed its emphasis on culturological aspects and moved towards structural functional approach by looking into historical specificities. Scholars argue that modernization theory is not universalistic, and in order to pursue an effective understanding of social change, one needs to go beyond the dichotomy of tradition and modernity scheme or continuum. Kamath argues this understanding can only be achieved by means of an inductive approach rather than a deductive positivistic paradigm. Conclusion. The module began with a discussion of what modernization is and several approaches to understanding it and how it is related to the idea of tradition. It then discussed modernization theory, an umbrella term for various theories and outlooks which sought to understand social change in the developing world. Next, it discusses the history of modernization in India and how this modernization project, which was introduced in the colonial era, was taken forward by the Indian national leaders with the aim of bringing about progressive social change in the Indian society. The subsequent section deals with some of the approaches used in analyzing social change in the traditional structures such as Sanskritization, Westernization, and little and great traditions. This is followed by a discussion on the impact of these modernization processes on both macro and micro social structures. Finally, it considers some critiques of the modernization theory. The main criticism being the fact that it takes for granted a distinct dichotomy between tradition and modernity as two mutually exclusive categories. As students of sociology, we need to be concerned about the fact that one perceives and understands tradition and modernity in terms of binaries. Rather than understanding it as dichotomies, it is very important that we understand modernity as contested. In order to do so, if the students follow the module on contested modernity, one would have a better understanding about how the whole discourse of tradition and modernity could be understood in India. And therefore, in order to question the current conceptualization of modernization, it is important to go beyond the current binary model of tradition and modernity in order to understand better the complexities involved in social change in India.